On February 15, 1989, at precisely 11:42 p.m., a frantic call came through to the police. The caller, a man named Paul Solomon, was in a state of panic. He was unable to comprehend what had just occurred, but his wife was lying motionless on the floor, surrounded by a pool of blood. When the police arrived at the scene, something felt off. There were no signs of a struggle, and all entry points to the home were secure. It appeared to be more of an ambush than a random act of violence. But what exactly had happened? Caroline Warmis was born on January 8, 1964, in the state of Michigan, USA. Her father, Tom Warmis, was what is often called a self-made millionaire, meaning his wealth wasn't inherited but earned through his work in the insurance industry. To give you an idea of his success, a March 1990 article in New York Magazine detailed Tom's assets, which included 8 private jets, 2 yachts, 15 luxury cars, and multiple homes. At that time, his net worth was estimated at around $150 million. Caroline was the first of 3 children born to Tom Warmis and Elizabeth, about whom little is known. Growing up, Caroline and her siblings had everything they could wish for, attending the best private schools and enjoying all the privileges that come with wealth. However, money couldn't buy happiness or stability in their family. When Caroline was 8 years old in 1972, her parents' marriage ended in a contentious and prolonged divorce. Caroline and her younger siblings, a brother and a sister, were drawn into a lengthy legal battle that eventually awarded custody of the children to their mother, Elizabeth. After the divorce, Caroline's relationship with her father grew increasingly distant. Though Tom continued to provide financial support, he was not an actively involved parent. Beyond these familial challenges, Caroline's early years were relatively uneventful. Those who knew her described her as a quiet, shy, and kind young woman. One anonymous source even called her the kind of girl you'd introduce to your mother. However, those closer to her, particularly her sister's friends, noted that Caroline often exhibited a competitive streak, especially toward her younger sister. This competitive nature and her difficulties in forming healthy relationships became more apparent after she graduated from high school and started college. Caroline attended the University of Michigan, where she began studying psychology. During this time, her life was marked by a series of romantic relationships, the most significant of which was with Paul Lavin in 1983. Caroline met Paul at the university, where he worked as an assistant professor in one of her classes. While details about their relationship are scarce, it's known that their breakup had a profound impact on Caroline. When Paul left her to get engaged to another student, Caroline became obsessed. She harassed the couple with incessant phone calls, left disturbing voicemail messages, stalked Paul at work, and even broke into the couple's shared apartment. On more than one occasion, the police had to be called to remove her from the premises. The situation was alarming, and Paul and his fiancée were so concerned that they sought a restraining order against Caroline, fearing she might crash their wedding, which was set for July 1984. Despite legal intervention, Caroline continued her harassment, even after Paul's fiancée became his wife. Her obsession was so intense that she spent months studying with a rabbi to convert to Judaism, hoping it might win Paul back. Friends of Caroline recalled this period as one of the darkest in her life. Some were so worried about her mental state that they feared she might attempt suicide, though there is no record of her actually trying to end her life. Despite the turmoil, Caroline eventually managed to move past the breakup, refocusing on her studies and ultimately graduating with a degree in psychology from the University of Michigan. In 1987, with her undergraduate degree in hand, Caroline decided to pursue a master's degree at Columbia University, which required her to move to New York City. During her early months there, she became involved with a married man named Jim Russo. Her obsession with him mirrored her earlier fixation on Paul. This time, Caroline went so far as to hire a private investigator to follow and monitor Jim's activities. Caroline was determined to end Jim Russo's marriage and hoped that the private investigator she hired could capture compromising photos of her former lover with another woman. However, when the investigator reported that he hadn't been able to obtain any incriminating photos, Caroline went as far as to suggest that he fabricate them. Despite her obsession, by September of that year, Caroline had completed her master's degree and secured a job as a computer teacher at Greenville Elementary School, located in Greenburgh, a residential suburb of New York. It was here that she met Paul Solomon, a 40-year-old fifth-grade teacher at the school. Not only was Paul 17 years older than Caroline, but he was also married for nearly 20 years to a woman named Betty Jean, with whom he had a 13-year-old daughter, Kristen, who attended the same school where Caroline and Paul taught. Despite these obstacles, Caroline and Paul began a romantic relationship. She confided to those around her that Paul's marriage was on the brink of ending. According to her, Solomon was merely waiting for his daughter to graduate before separating from Betty. Whether Paul truly had such intentions is unclear, but it seems his marriage was indeed troubled. Both he and Betty had engaged in extramarital affairs, and their relationship was far from ideal. According to Betty's mother, Paul was extremely controlling, possessive, and jealous, which had caused Betty Jean to become increasingly withdrawn and isolated over the years. By the late 1980s, Betty had even started contemplating divorce, possibly influenced by the presence of Caroline in their lives. Betty was unaware of the true nature of Caroline's relationship with her husband, thinking of her merely as a friend of the family. For instance, Kristen recalled in court the first time she met Caroline. It happened after school one day when her father was helping her and her basketball team with practice. Without prior invitation, Caroline joined the game as if she belonged there. In the months that followed, Caroline's presence became more frequent. She attended all of Kristen's games, joined the family and another teacher at a Christmas show in Manhattan, and constantly asked Kristen if her mother liked her. Caroline was desperate to be accepted into the Solomon family circle. Though their affair continued, Paul eventually asked Caroline to stop interacting with his family, following an incident that had deeply unsettled him. In August 1988, when Kristen turned 16, Caroline sent 2 extravagant gifts to the Solomon home: 2 designer outfits and a Tiffany bracelet. These gifts were excessive, especially considering Caroline barely knew the teenager, and even more so given that Paul had explicitly told her to stay away from his wife and daughter. Despite this, Paul didn't end their relationship. They continued seeing each other even after Caroline left Greenville Elementary School. As time went on, Paul showed no signs of leaving Betty, instead remaining committed to his marriage. For some, this was the trigger for the events of February 1989. Others speculate that around that time Paul might have attempted to break things off with Caroline, who was then 25 years old. Whatever the reason, these events would change the lives of the Solomons and Caroline forever. On the night of February 15, 1989, at precisely 11:42 p.m., the police in Scarsdale, a city close to Greenburgh where the Solomon family lived, received a frantic call from Paul Solomon. He was so distraught that he mistakenly dialed the wrong police department, forcing the dispatcher to transfer his call to the Greenburgh police. When officers finally arrived at the Solomon residence, they found Paul still in shock and the scene gruesome. In the middle of the living room floor, lying in a pool of fresh blood, was Betty, face down with multiple gunshot wounds to her back and leg. Initial assessments of the crime scene revealed no signs of forced entry through the windows or doors. The room where Betty's body was found was undisturbed, with nothing out of place or stolen, leading investigators to conclude that robbery was not the motive. A preliminary forensic examination of Betty's body determined that she had been shot at least 8 times, with 6 shell casings found in the living room. In cases where the victim is found by their spouse, the first line of investigation typically focuses on the possibility of domestic violence. Naturally, Paul Solomon became the prime suspect and person of interest. He was the first to be questioned, giving his account at the crime scene and then repeatedly at the police station in the following days. Each time, Paul's story remained consistent, without any discrepancies that might suggest he was lying. Moreover, his alibi was solid and verifiable. That evening, Paul left his home and drove to a bowling alley located about 5 miles from his house. He parked his car and entered the venue, which he frequented often. Upon arrival, he went straight to a group of people who were already playing, greeted them, and joined their table. This was the initial version of events that Paul shared with the detectives handling the case, but he left out a significant portion of his plans for that night. During his first visit to the police station, Paul added crucial information he had previously omitted. Around 7:15 p.m., after receiving a phone call, he abruptly left the bowling alley without saying goodbye or explaining why. From there, Paul drove to the Holiday Inn, a hotel located in Yonkers, a city not far from where he was. His destination was the Treetops restaurant within the hotel. At approximately 7:45 p.m., his lover, Caroline Warmis, entered the restaurant and joined him. They had dinner together and shared several drinks. After their meal, Paul paid the bill, and the couple, who had arrived separately, left the restaurant together. They headed to the parking lot, specifically to Caroline's car, where they engaged in sexual activity. Afterward, Paul returned to his car and began the drive back to his home, while Caroline took the route to her apartment in Manhattan. Naturally, the first thing the police did was verify Paul's story. Indeed, Paul had been seen at the places he claimed to have been. The only discrepancy was in the timing. There was a slight difference between the hours Paul reported and the actual events. However, this difference was only a matter of minutes, making it inconsequential and not altering the facts. The police decided to investigate Caroline by calling her in for questioning. The then 25-year-old agreed to come to the station, but upon arrival she refused to speak without her lawyer present. This, combined with her history of obsessive behavior toward former lovers, made her incredibly suspicious to the detectives. However, suspicion alone did not make her the killer. Despite their doubts about Caroline and her behavior, the police had no concrete evidence linking her to the crime scene or justifying the continuation of the investigation. As a result, the case began to cool down until April and May of 1989. It was then that the police obtained a warrant to review Caroline Warmis's phone records, focusing on calls made before and after the crime. Through this analysis, they discovered a number Caroline had called repeatedly before February 15th, the day of the murder. The number belonged to the private investigator Caroline had previously hired to track one of her lovers, take photos, and essentially stalk him. When the police spoke with the investigator, he admitted that Caroline was indeed a client of his and recounted the work he had done for her in the past. However, he claimed that he hadn't done any other jobs for her and that Caroline would contact him just to chat and keep in touch. Despite his story, it seemed weak and constructed. Every time he was asked to repeat it, there were significant changes in how he told it. Under pressure and the threat of jail time for obstructing a criminal investigation and engaging in illegal activities, he eventually revealed the truth. He testified that the day before the crime, Caroline had called him to ask how she could obtain a gun. According to her, she needed it for her own safety. The investigator later testified in court that Warmis was in a hurry to get a gun, frequently calling to insist on his help. She not only wanted a gun but also a silencer to go with it. Initially, the private investigator refused her request, but after constant pressure and an offer of $2,500, he finally agreed. In January 1989, the investigator sold her a semi-automatic revolver complete with a silencer. The gun had been a gift the investigator had received from a friend, and the silencer had been custom-made for the revolver by another friend who owned a gun shop in Brooklyn. The police were able to confirm the investigator's entire account. There was no doubt that the weapon he had sold to Caroline Warmis was the same one used to murder Betty Solomon. Additionally, the detective who was leading the case discovered that the phone records showed calls between Caroline and the investigator on the day she received the weapon, January 15, 1989. Surprisingly, Caroline had made a call from her Manhattan apartment to Raceport Shop, a store located over 20 miles from her home. The police decided to review the sales records from the day Betty was murdered, as the store sold ammunition for various firearms. They discovered that on February 15th, 3 sales of ammunition had been made. Since such transactions are always documented, it was easy to identify the purchasers. 2 were men, and the third was a woman named Lisa, who had shown her New York driver's license. Naturally, the police tracked down Lisa to speak with her. Lisa adamantly denied ever visiting Raceport Shop in Yonkers, let alone purchasing ammunition there. She also claimed that she didn't even have her driver's license at the time, as it had gone missing during the summer while she was working. She wasn't sure whether it had been stolen or simply lost. But the most intriguing part? She added that during her summer job, she had worked alongside a woman named Caroline Warmis. Things were starting to fall into place. Caroline had legally purchased a gun through the private investigator, matching the characteristics of the murder weapon. She had also called a store in Yonkers to ensure they had the correct ammunition for her revolver and then drove over 20 miles to purchase bullets, a rather suspicious act. Moreover, she had used a driver's license that didn't belong to her, an ID that had been lost by her summer co-worker. The coincidences were piling up, all pointing toward Caroline as the prime suspect. On February 2, 1990, with the case now gaining public attention and significant media interest, Caroline Warmis was officially charged with second-degree murder, and a warrant was issued for her arrest. Caroline was taken into custody, and her bail was set at $250,000. By this time, nearly a year after the crime, the case had become widely known. For instance, HBO had already produced 2 documentary films about it, and various media outlets portrayed Caroline as either a femme fatale or a cold, ruthless killer devoid of compassion. As expected, the trial garnered massive media coverage. On January 14, 1991, nearly 2 years after Betty Solomon's death, the trial began in White Plains, New York. Witnesses included the private investigator, Paul Solomon, and his daughter, in addition to the evidence mentioned earlier. The prosecution presented a crucial piece of evidence, a call Betty made to 911 at around 7:15 p.m. on the night of the murder. The call lasted only seconds, during which Betty was heard saying, "He or she is trying to kill me." However, the 911 operator couldn't determine if she was referring to a male or female attacker, and the call was abruptly cut off before further questions could be asked. Due to a mix-up in the phone records, the police were initially dispatched to the wrong address, delaying their response to the Solomon home. Caroline's defense attorney argued that the evidence was not only circumstantial but also presented with a bias meant to frame his client. He also claimed that the private investigator had been hired by Paul Solomon to fabricate evidence against Warmis. The first trial lasted about 3 months and concluded after 12 days of jury deliberation. The jury was split in favor of convicting Caroline but couldn't reach the necessary unanimous verdict, leading the judge to declare a mistrial on April 27th of that year. In January 1992, a second trial began, during which the prosecution introduced new evidence, a black glove with blood that allegedly belonged to Caroline. This glove had been previously dismissed as evidence by the police, but was mysteriously allowed into the case between the first and second trials, a move that the defense repeatedly questioned and criticized. This trial also lasted 3 months, with the verdict delivered on May 27, 1992. After 6 days of deliberation, the jury found Caroline guilty of second-degree murder and illegal possession of a firearm. On June 26, 1992, the judge, who had presided over both trials, sentenced Caroline Warmis to a maximum of 25 years in prison for the murder and an additional 5 to 15 years for the weapons charge, to be served concurrently. After her sentencing, Caroline spoke publicly for the first time during the trials, maintaining her innocence, a stance she held throughout her time in prison. Her time in prison was reportedly tumultuous, with multiple conflicts involving other inmates and correctional officers. Caroline applied for parole several times but was denied in 2016, 2017, and 2018. It wasn't until her fourth attempt in 2019 that she was finally granted parole. Even today, Caroline continues to assert her innocence, claiming that Paul Solomon orchestrated her downfall to ensure she would be imprisoned. She occasionally appears in documentary specials about her case, maintaining that she was wrongfully convicted. Thanks for tuning in to Unreal True Crime. If you're intrigued by mysteries from around the world, check out our new channel, Latin Crimes, where we dive into the gripping true crime stories of Latin America. Don't miss out. Subscribe now for more thrilling investigations.